Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. It's been a stunning turn of events after 13 years of war and an apparent victory over rebel forces just a few years back. Assad's regime has collapsed in a matter of days. An Islamist leader now leads an alliance of rebels hoping to form a new government. What will it mean for Syria, the region, and the world? Sebastian Usher is the BBC's Middle East editor and a frequent contributor to our tours. Hello and welcome, Sebastian.
Hi, very happy to be here.
Excellent, great to have you with us. Some people don't know you, some people do. Those who've joined our Experts Weekend or maybe have been on a trip to Jordan certainly know you very well. But just tell us a bit more about you. I want to say that your expertise dates back ages ago, long time ago, in 1980s. You at Beirut University, so there's there's a lot of experience there.
There is, now you mention it. It's not, I didn't actually intend to be a Middle East expert, I have to say. It just kind of happened. I got drawn to the Middle East through family connections. Very briefly, my grandparents lived in Beirut. I spent summers there when I was a kid. And when I got the opportunity straight after university, strange enough, someone showed up in London whose husband had been kidnapped and this, that, and the other. They had nobody working at the American University of Beirut. And the opportunity came up and I thought, great, it'd give me a chance to go to this place. But I went to, when I was a little kid, just remembered, and had featured in the news for years and years and years. I went off and that set me off on that path, really. Quite a lot of interesting, exciting events there. I even met my wife while I was there and so on and so forth. With the Middle East, I've had times when I've been less involved with it. In the 90s, I was much more involved with Europe and East Europe. And as a journalist, I really only became like a full-time sort of news journalist, rather a feature person and a writer, I guess, towards the end of the 90s. And then when I sort of joined the BBC, I ended up with BBC Arabic for a while, almost by mistake, because I'd written many articles for an Arab newspaper, Al Hayat, which had been beautifully translated into Arabic. I'd not actually written them in Arabic, but the BBC Arabic service believed that I had, so they gave me no test, and there I was. And I moved from there as fast as I could, because it was slightly taxing, not having Arabic as good as it should have been. And I kind of was the Middle East person for a while, and then I just got bored with the endless cycle, not going anywhere.
I'm going to jump in there. I want to say what you do now, which is, you really do the World Service. You're aware of the Arabic coverage, and really you know this very, very well. So I want to sort of jump in straight away and talk about what you've been looking at most recently.
Yeah.
I think. Where to start? Let's just go straight in on the most recent things. What have this rebel force been doing since they've got to Damascus?
They've been really on a PR campaign, I guess, which is something they did very successfully in the lead up to this extraordinary advance, which appeared to come out of nowhere. But when you look at it more closely, it didn't. People were paying attention. You could see that something was brewing. But PR in the sense of remolding their image, rebranding themselves, and very much as they went into each of the cities, I'm sure many of the people who are watching this, are aware of this, that they took a message with them to each of these cities. Aleppo, Hama, these are places where there are many different communities, different religions, and ones where they obviously would be fearful of a group that had been a jihadist and an out-and-out jihadist group not that long ago. And so their message was, both to their own fighters, was not to compel anyone to do anything in terms of religion or ideology, not give a sense to anyone that there'd be any new imposition in terms of the way people dress, the way they have to act, and also that there wouldn't be revenge of any immediate kind, that justice will play itself out, but it won't play itself out on the streets in bloodshed. Now, we've seen this many times before with similar groups, and it's all ended in disaster, but this is natural enough how they've set themselves up, and they've continued on this route. since Damascus. I mean, Damascus, in a sense, didn't really fall, it just evaporated. And HTS, the jihadist group, which was coming in from the north, was still just coming through Homs at the time when it became clear that Damascus had been vacated by President Assad and by the elite, and no battle was going to happen. So the people who actually went in first were sort of rebels who'd been dormant for years, back down in the south from Deraa, from Sweda, from the east. And they'd been able to move up unimpeded because essentially the government forces had given no fight. They'd been so they arrived first, and they found that Damascus was theirs. So HTS came a little bit later, and since it's been there the last 48 hours or so, it's been moving quite quickly to make good on its promise of a smooth transition of power. So there were meetings at the Four Seasons Hotel between members of what they call a rebel coalition. Again, we have to see whether it holds to that, and it's very much dominated by HTS, with some of the officials who felt that they could still perhaps play a role, officials from Assad's time, who felt that they could perhaps still play a role in the way things now develop, not the real elite around President Assad, all of whom I would imagine have got out of the place, for ones who feel that if they were there, they'd be in serious danger.
The ministries are going back to work. The central bank is working. Anybody who's been a conscript has been given, there's an amnesty for conscripts. So and even talking to the Russians and saying that they can keep their bases, one naval base and one air base, both on the east of the country on the Mediterranean coast.
Yes, I mean, exactly. I mean, it is an attempt to have, as I say, as smooth a movement towards a new future for Syria, but not destroying and demolishing the past, so there's nothing there to build on. And what the rebels took was essentially the 60% rump of Syria that President Assad was ruling over for the past 7 or 8 years, the main cities. There are many other parts of Syria where essentially President Assad's rule either was very, very light and limited, or really didn't exist at all. So, that's for later, I think, in a sense. But the immediate problem was that power vacuum, and they have done what they can to close that down. So they've announced a prime minister, a man called Mohammed al-Bashir. He is an administrator. These rebels, the HTS, come from Idlib. That's where they established a statelet. That's in the northwest. That's where around 1.5 million Syrians who were displaced, particularly from Aleppo, from some of the last holdouts of the rebels, they were forced there 5 or 6 years ago now, and they've lived in very difficult conditions there. HTS has become the dominant force, although it's faced opposition there from other factions. It has itself been involved in a certain amount of repression. There are human rights abuses that have been alleged against them there. It certainly is an Islamist organization, so it is setting out laws and rules according to the Sharia, but not in the sort of sense that we think of with the Taliban, or we think of with Iran, or we think of Saudi Arabia before it moved and changed a few years ago. Then they've said that women can continue to dress as they wish to. It's certainly not. It's not going to be a Taliban state. That is not what they're setting out to do.
I mean, that's the big question. What kind of state is it going to be? And that seems unclear at the moment. But let's just go back a bit then and look at Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's background. They actually come out of Al-Qaeda and really out of Iraq initially. And that's the stunning thing. So there's a big transition that's gone on here.
They do. I mean, the man who's the leader, who's known by his nom de guerre, though he's now reverted back to his own name, again, in a rebranding attempt. But I mean, he's known as Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, Jilani because he comes from the Golan. And he spent time in Iraqi prisons when the US, after the invasion, when it was trying to control the situation there. And he met and worked out strategy with the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr Baghdadi. And he was sent by him to Syria, essentially to set up an offshoot. At the time, it was Al-Qaeda, in Syria. And that's what he started to do. So a violent jihadist organization. This was after the revolution had started, the uprising. This was until 2012, when the uprising was already beginning to move from the people who'd risen up in the streets, very much not non-violent, but when they faced the violence from the Syrian government forces, the Syrian paramilitaries, violence then began to be on both sides. And these jihadist fighters very much fit into that. I mean, it suited what they wanted to do, which was essentially to push the revolution towards their aims of creating a jihadist state there. So that's what he was doing at first.
But then there's this transition from that's the al-Nusra Front is Al-Qaeda's sort of network of which Al-Qaeda's organization within Syria. But then there's this transition when they are in Idlib, they adapt themselves to less of an Islamist organization. Well, definitely Islamist, but not tactically.
There is, but I think we just have to linger just a moment longer on that past, because it matters. I mean, Nusra, I remember very well as being. I mean, if you remember and people who are listening remember, the rebels were essentially seen as a secular force who were forcing out a dictator. They were backed by the West. When al-Nusra began to appear, the West, the US, began to get cold feet about this, because they thought and they could see that the weapons that they might give to the rebels would actually go to a jihadist organization. And that's one of the main reasons that the US and the West were so utterly useless in backing up their promises to the rebels, and why Russia was able to step in and fulfill its promises and keep President Assad in power. So Nusra played, if you're looking at from a rebel's perspective, quite a negative role at that time, and I don't think that will be forgotten. After that, in 2016, it's true, he broke al-Jilani with al-Qaeda, and then, as you say, we can go on to Idlib and how that statelet has been run since.
Okay, and we'll talk about that briefly, and then we'll come on to the geopolitical aspects of this, because the geopolitical aspects are huge, of course. So how did they run Idlib?
Well, I mean, you have to understand that this was and has been a corner of Syria that was under almost constant attack for several years by Syrian government forces, by Russian air power. For 2 or 3 years, Assad and Russia tried to take it back, tried to dislodge the remainder of the rebels there. They believed that they could defeat it. So the first period that HTS was developing there and developing its administration, it was essentially still a fighting organization, fighting every day in the towns and the villages and trying to survive. And in incredibly difficult circumstances, as I say, more than 1 million people displaced from other parts of Syria, living in tent cities, incredibly difficult conditions, winters each year when, people would die of cold, children would barely be able to be clothed. So that only began to change in 2020, 4 years ago, when there was a deal done between Turkey, which backed the rebels, and Iran and Russia, which backed President Assad. And that essentially stopped the continued attack on Idlib by Assad and by Russia, and by Turkey from the north as well. And that gave HTS and the other factions there the space, sorry, let me just drink something, to try to construct some form of administration, some form of government there, which is what they've done. HTS faced opposition from other groups. There's been internecine fighting. They have locked up people. There have been summary executions. There's been torture. There has been a battle by HTS to have the supremacy that it now has. But there's no doubt that over the last 3 or 4 years, it pretty much ran that place. What it was doing is really 2 things. One was proving itself as an organization that could be pragmatic, that could park the ideology and try to run this mini state, semi-autonomous state with all those problems, according to Sharia, but not, again, in terms of the Taliban, in terms of Iran, where people would be whipped if they disobeyed, all that kind of stuff. So the real excesses not really happening there. And the other, which perhaps people were not paying attention to, was it was building up its military capability, getting supplies of weapons across the Turkish border, developing new tactics that they were using, drones, for example, that we saw in the past 2 weeks of their advance. So they were going on those two courses really, and there was a sense, I think, that people felt that their ambitions didn't go that far beyond Idlib at that time. They weren't constantly saying, we must topple Assad, this is our end game, we must bring Sharia law and Islam to Syria. That wasn't what was being heard from them. What was really being heard was their efforts to run and be able to control and be able to benefit the people living in those very difficult circumstances, and then more covertly build their military strength. And what has been the big surprise, what everybody was caught out by, was the fact that that was going on in such a way that people just weren't noticing it, weren't marking it. And they weren't making, as I say, a big song and dance about it. So, you know, there is some question mark over when they launched the attack on Aleppo. At that point, was their final sights on toppling Assad, or did the momentum carry them away much more quickly than they expected? Were they just trying to expand their area, having relatively successfully built up a power base in Idlib, take over the nearby countryside and take over Aleppo, and then move on from there? And then it just escalated from there. We really don't know at the moment. It could be either way.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating question. My follow-up question to that would be, what's Turkey's involvement with this? What's their relationship with Turkey?
I think Turkey backs another faction really up in the north, the Syrian National Army, and the main reason that it has that faction is in order to fight the Kurds, both in areas over to the west, but obviously more importantly over to the east. And Turkey, regards the Kurds in Syria as a terrorist organization, as part and parcel of the PKK in Turkey, the separatist organization there that they've been fighting for decades now, in what is at times a very, very violent, aggressive combat. And so Turkey, I think it more... I think, again, it was one of the ways that people took their eyes off what was happening in Idlib and with HTS, because what Turkey seemed to, as I say, be most preoccupied with was dealing with the Kurds, creating a buffer zone. There were several incursions that Turkey carried out before 2020 when this deal was done to try and calm the situation. So I think it's been relatively covert, actually, its support for HTS. It hasn't been massively out in the open, but it's been quite clear from what has happened that there was very, very serious support. There's no way that HTS would have been able to get hold of the weaponry that it has without Turkish without Ankara allowing them to. That's the border. There's no other way that it would reach them. There's no other option within Syria, coming across from Iraq. No.
Yeah.
So Turkey is playing a role, but again, it's part of a geopolitical dilemma that is now presented, that these players that we've seen in Syria, who seem to have quite clear goals, quite clear aims, quite demarcated zones of interest within Syria, that all is up in the air again now. So Turkey, as I say, seems to be more preoccupied just with carving out that area in the north and protecting that, rather than going deeper and further. But through HTS, again, whether by design or by default, it now is the main player again, I would say, in Turkey. In Syria at the moment.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. I'd love to get questions, people. So if you can start putting your questions either in the Q&A box or raise your hand. I see Vaughan Grills is there already. I'll come to you in just a second, Vaughan. Yeah, then we'll be able to get your questions directly to Sebastian. I guess people might say we've seen this before. Revolution all goes sour. I mean, I heard the World at One here on the BBC Radio 4 talking about will there be democracy in Syria? And I thought, hang on a second.
Yeah, that's getting ahead of yourself.
Don't get ahead of yourself. Where has it gone badly beforehand, and why?
You name it. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. I mean, one of the things that one's hearing a lot from people inside and outside Syria is that we are not going to make the same mistakes. But the proviso that people are saying is that may be our intention, but the outside forces may not give us the space, may not allow us to avoid those mistakes. I mean, what happened? I mean, people have compared this to Libya, obviously, the very sudden fall of Gaddafi in the end, and then the terrible chaos that has ensued ever since. I mean, there hasn't really been a moment when it looked like Libya was coming together. Again, that was a hollowed out state where a dictator had been in charge for years and years and years. But I think, and again, one which was characterized, as Iraq was, by a terror police state, essentially, where people were frightened into obedience because of the horror that might await them if they even voice a whisper of dissent in private. And that's what a lot of the attention has been in the last day or so about the prison, Sednaya, where people have been spending the last couple of days trying to get to what they think are people who are kind of almost buried underground, who've been kept for years and years as political prisoners. So there's all of that. I mean, I think on the more optimistic side, you could say, though it's been a horrific process, it's been a very long one. I mean, this is the culmination of something which began in 2011, and it began in hope in 2011, and it's culminating in hope now. And there are many, many people who were energized at that moment by the Arab Spring, who have been strategizing and thinking ever since. Now, whether they're the ones who are in Damascus and who are going to call the shots now, obviously that's a big question. But there are many people who are potentially in a position that they could play a role where the thinking about where Syria could go as a state without this, mad rush towards a chimera of democracy that Iraq did and kind of failed miserably at when it's not, it doesn't have the time, doesn't have the space to, that could help the optimism from the sense of the diaspora outside, again, a very sophisticated, many of them, very well-educated diaspora, and desperate to come back, to return to their homes that they never thought they'd see really again. And in doing so, making a stake in the country. I mean, I think that actually, when I think about it, and maybe this is being a bit kind of Pollyanna-ish and over-optimistic, but what didn't happen in Iraq, what hasn't happened in Libya, is people feeling they have a stake in even a moment within that society where it's moving forward. Now, either they were denied that, or they are part of groups and factions that didn't want that to happen. But there hasn't really been a moment in those countries where people had something to lose. At the moment, I think Syrians do feel there is something to lose. There is, even though the country is a disunited mosaic, broken mosaic of these different areas controlled by different groups, there is a unity of hope, obviously, after 5 decades of the Assads, and the potential of a breath of a completely different way of looking at things coming in from outside, as well as some remnants of civil society that remained in Syria throughout all of what's been going on, in places like Deraa, in places like Sweda, where there was a light touch from the Syrian government. Over in the east with the Kurds, Deir ez-Zor, you have place Aleppo when it's been kind of rebuilt and re-emerged as an economic hub of the country. All of these places have groups of people who may be able to play a part in seeing a unified vision of how the country could be put together piece by piece without rushing towards one option or another. But it has to be given, obviously, the time and the space. And the other thing just to bear in mind, obviously, is the terrifyingly appalling a situation with the economy. I mean, that has just got even worse, obviously, over the past few weeks. President Assad did nothing to move that forward during this time of status quo and stalemate, when the war had essentially stopped. Nothing to reach out to the other parts of society to say, now let's look at other institutions. Nothing to look after the interests of the majority of the Syrian people, 90% of whom, in the country at the moment, are in dire economic straits.
That's possibly one of the reasons where people talk about the collapse of Hezbollah, the Russians being distracted elsewhere, but perhaps not enough attention given to the economy and the fact that the regime really couldn't finance itself or the country.
It could finance itself, but I mean that's a very limited. I mean, it would become really the closest intimates of Assad, both inside and outside the country, and the organizations connected with them. And that's one of the reasons, for example, that the army was so hollowed out. I mean, the army was never great, the conscript army. It wasn't great when it was in Lebanon, even though it was essentially controlling Lebanon. And it was essentially defeated in 2014, 2015 by the rebels, and then saved at the last moment by Russia's intervention. And the fact that the US and the West didn't give that extra push in terms of weaponry that the rebels needed to finish the job. So I don't think anybody expected that much from the army, but it's symptomatic of the way that the corruption permeated everything, as it did in Iraq. I mean, remember when ISIS suddenly emerged in 2014, there's meant to be, tens of thousands of soldiers in Mosul and all around there who will stop a little group like this suddenly emerging, but they didn't exist. They either didn't report as soldiers, or they had no training, they had no morale, they evaporated. The only groups, and this is a question that people are asking themselves in Syria about how quickly it went, was this disbelief that there wasn't the hardcore, the Praetorian Guard around Assad, who felt that it was worth holding on, staging a fight that they might even have won, at least give them some time and see if a political process could finally be launched. Because there was diplomacy going on in Doha, Iran, Russia, Turkey were talking, Arab leaders were coming, and they actually came up with a plan. I mean, I saw the plan 12 hours before Damascus fell, like a 9-point plan in which Assad would be there for another 6 or 12 months in a transition period. And this was being presented in an Arab capital with Arab leaders there and the main players. So I think there'd been a sense amongst Syrians, amongst people outside, that there would be some fight when it came down to it. But I think what happened is not just that the state was hollowed out, but even the little state within the state was hollowed out, the one around Assad, his intimates, his people, they're out of there.
If you know that he's going in 12 months, your time's up. So
that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, let's take a question now. Take some questions. Vaughan Grills, go ahead, please, Vaughan. You need to open your microphone, bottom left-hand side of your screen. And if you're not going to do it, Vaughan,
I got it.
You got it? Well done, yeah, go on.
Okay, this Western trope of the overthrow of a tyrant now means that the shining sun of democracy can now rise at last, as it has done, so-called, in Iran, in Libya and Zimbabwe. But the thing is that why is it that the CIA, our secret services, CIA and MI6 in particular, who must have seen this coming, and if they hadn't seen it coming, why have they kept quiet about it, so that now we're caught out with this astonishing news? Why is it that, given the investment, the political investment in what's been happening in Syria, it has now sort of caught us out in a shock. It's extraordinary.
Gordon, I'm glad you have so much faith in the intelligence services. It's
well, of course, we pay them.
I mean, I would ask two questions to that. One is, what real commitment and stakes, if you're talking about CIA and MI5 or whatever, what did they really have in Syria? I mean, the US, the UK, the West had not been the major players in the internal workings of Syria for quite a long time. Yes, there are areas, especially the east with the Kurds, etc., on the Iraqi border, where there are still some US troops. Yes, of course, there are intelligence services that are operative there. But I mean, the people, the main forces, the main countries that were most strongly involved in the last 7 or 8 years were Iran and Russia, and they were blindsided. And they had people on the ground all the time. They had bases there. I mean, Russia has an air base. Russia has a naval base. Yes. Iran has its military advisors there in Damascus, essentially briefing and helping and keeping President Assad in power. They were blindsided. So the question to me isn't specifically, I would say, about CIA or MI6 or whatever, but about their intelligence agencies, because they're the ones who had the most to lose in this particular juncture, right, I would say.
Okay, let's take a question from, I'm picking questions out here. Howard Gatiss, go on.
I haven't followed this in detail, but what I've heard today is what seemed to be a mildly positive reaction to what's happened and to possible recognition of the rebels as a government from David Lammy here, but a much more hardline instant reaction from whoever is this week's EU's foreign spokesman, who appeared to be saying, I'm never saying never, but we're not changing our stance at all for the moment. Am I right to read that? Is that the difficulty for the EU in some ways of trying to balance the views of 27 different nations? Do I read that rightly?
To be honest, I haven't looked at an EU reaction today, but I mean, I would say I wouldn't have, I mean, perhaps there is a distinction. I wouldn't have thought there's a huge difference in reality between the reaction in the EU and the reaction in the UK. I mean, in each, it's a kind of, obviously a very mixed reaction. Of course, there is some satisfaction in the fall of President Assad. I mean, the EU to an extent, the UK certainly, the US, of course, were essentially setting out the downfall, the toppling of President Assad as a major aim, if you go back a decade. But of course, that's countered with what we've been saying, and I'm sure you are very much aware of this, with the background of the rebels who've now taken over Syria, and the fact that HTS is still a prescribed terrorist group amongst many countries. And I believe that Jelani still has a price on his head. And I think the sort of political reactions that I've seen and that one's going to have from countries that haven't taken a really clear side either way in the conflict over the past decade or so. I mean, they're not Russia, they're not Turkey, they're not Iran, for example, is slightly strangulated officialese in which they don't want to commit themselves either way. They certainly don't want to look like they are lamenting the downfall of a dictator, but nor do they want to look like they're celebrating the arrival of what might be a jihadist, a jihadist power that could cause all sorts of problems in Syria, obviously, that we haven't necessarily seen its true nature by any means. And as Nick was saying, I mean, there are many examples, Afghanistan, Iraq, to name just a couple, where things have gone very, very badly. And the sort of forces that we've seen at play over the past couple of weeks have been involved. I mean, I think one thing the US has been making a big deal about, I'm not sure that it is such an urgent I'm in such an emergency in the midst of everything else that's going on, but to warn that ISIS, which still has some presence, I mean, not, I think, a very strong presence, but obviously it can develop from there as it did all those years ago in Iraq, in the desert mainly, several thousand members, that it could benefit, take advantage of the situation, and gain strength again. And the US has been very, very strong about that. President Biden was making a big deal about that. But then that is what the US has seen its mission as, whether it's true or not, but publicly at least, with Syria over the last, I mean, since the early days, the first years of the civil war, when it looked like President Assad might be brought down, when it looked like it wasn't going to happen. And then ISIS emerged. The US-led coalition, its aim, obviously other things happened too, but its aim was to defeat ISIS, and it did that with the help of the Kurds in the east, and that was accomplished pretty much 5 or 6 years ago. There's around 900 US troops that are still there, and there's still an engagement by the US. But I think the days when the US was the real power, not just in Syria, but in the region, in the Middle East as a whole, I think those have been fading for some time, and there are other forces which have gained much greater traction. I think the EU, as I say, is just caught in the middle. It doesn't know quite what to say at the moment, and is waiting. I mean, as everyone's waiting, as Syrians are waiting to see how this plays out.
There's a good piece in the Financial Times today about how the EU needs to learn about power and using it. Anyway, that's a distraction. Just to reinforce your point, the Americans have been bombing ISIS Sunday and today. Let's take a question from Marty Ryan. Go ahead, Marty.
I was very surprised that Assad went to Russia instead of Iran. And I'm curious as to what you think is going to be the impact on Iran of this, and how that might impact Iran's support of their three groups in the Middle East.
Shia Crescent.
Yeah, I mean, Iran. I think there's even been some acknowledgement in Iran on in the media by some figures, political figures, that things have not gone very well for Iran in the past year. And this is the culmination of that. I mean, Syrians are in general, as you'd imagine, no friends of Israel, but there's no doubt that Israel's offensive against Hezbollah and its attacks on Iran have seriously weakened what was, I mean, Hezbollah is much more than just a proxy, but it certainly, in the Iranian context, was its most powerful tool in this region, and played an absolutely vital role in keeping President Assad going. But the hit that it's taken over the past year, but particularly in the past 2 months, made it unable to provide that kind of support. And Iran was essentially using Syrian territory to get its weapons to Hezbollah. They won't perhaps be able to do that anymore. And Iran was backing President Assad as its strongest territorial position, really, in the Middle East. So it's a massive blow for Iran. I'm not surprised, though, that he didn't go to Iran, I have to say. I don't think that Bashar would feel particularly at home then. I think when we've seen him travel abroad, it's been very much as a satellite of Putin. His first visits, when he finally left the palace after years there, when the war was at its hardest, were to Russia. And it was to Russia, it seems, that he went just a week or two ago to really find out if they were going to come to his support, and that the message perhaps was unlikely that he was going to do that. So no, I mean, I think people generally would have been more surprised if it had been Iran that he had gone to. I think Russia seems like the most natural place for him to be.
Or perhaps Knightsbridge for his wife.
Yeah,
indeed. I just want to take a moment to think about how Giuliani has been trying to keep everybody on engaged. So the Russians, the Alawites, there's a substantial Alawite community on the Mediterranean coast. I'm trying to get, if you're trying to have good relationships with the outside world, with everyone, what kind of can you guess what kind of state this is going to be? It's going to be Islamist. You're not expecting elections. What kind of setup do you think he could go for or is going for?
Well, I mean, I don't know if that is necessarily the case. I mean, I don't think that it being led by Islamists means there aren't going to be elections. Take Tunisia, for example, which was seen for a long time, I mean, cliche time, but is one of almost successes of the 2011 uprisings, perhaps the only one. And that was definitely a place where the Islamists were the dominant force, and they very much tried to play their role within the context of a secular state with elections and a democracy, and not to put their ideology first. That didn't work. That hasn't really worked out for all sorts of reasons, but that certainly was attempted in Egypt after Mubarak was kicked out, and when the Muslim Brotherhood briefly took over, they did the opposite. They put their ideology first. They lasted a year, desperately unpopular. I would have thought. I mean, I do not know, but from what we've seen, what we've heard, what one imagines would be obviously the most pragmatic, positive approach. And also Giuliani, what we know of him to an extent about his upbringing, his education, the way he presents himself, the way that he's been a bit of a chameleon. I mean, if you look back at pictures of him in the days of al-Nusra, he's there. He's covered. He's got. Then he was wearing civilian clothes. Now he is in military fatigues. He reminded me a bit of a Jerry Adams character to some extent, changing his garb according to what is most suitable at the time. Now that could be seen by some people, maybe within his own movement, as hypocritical, as superficial, as a betrayal. Others might see it as pragmatism and a positive sign that he is showing that he is willing to moderate the full force of what he may believe ideologically in order to benefit the wider needs of the state. And you mentioned the Alawites, but there's many other minorities too in Syria. Now, this will probably make me unpopular, but Hezbollah down in the south of Lebanon, though there's never any question about they're the people who hold the power, and you don't want to say things about Hezbollah that are bad down there. But from the first day, I remember going down there quite shortly after Israel being forced out of a buffer zone and spending a month down there. And there was no sense that women who were not Muslims were being forced to dress. I mean, if anybody knows Lebanon, I mean, they know how everyone dresses there and everything like that. It's high fashion and so on and so forth. There was no push to make people dress that way down there. You could get alcohol, etc., etc. Now, these on the surface seem very minor things, but they matter in terms of how not just the perception outside, the perception within the country, and people feeling more comfortable with what's going on. One of the things that the HTS has said since it has taken power has been reassurance to women there that they can dress as they like. There'll be no imposition of any dress code. When you talk about the Alawites, again, we really don't know what, I mean, again, one of the hopeful things potentially is maybe there wasn't any sign of this that early on after the downfall of Saddam Hussein, but I think it happened very, very quickly. There was a sense that there were parts of the state that had gone underground and were very, very quickly refusing to accept any other power. We haven't seen the faintest hint of that at the moment in the Alawite areas, in the areas where you might expect it to happen, which is, a very positive thing. I mean, I think it.
The Americans went into Iraq and entirely hollowed out the states. And if you were Sunni and if you were in any way connected to the government previously, you were not welcome. And that created an enormous ground swelling for some kind of uprising. You could actually feel it.
Yes.
But in addition to that, I'm also thinking about the regional. So you've got, the people who took Damascus, came from Daraa and from the south. And the Kurds are probably a separate entity, but you've got many groups of people as well as your Islamist base to please.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, that is. That was what I was kind of wrestling with, just in the immediate tumult of the events of who is actually in Damascus. When they talk about a coalition, what does that involve? Who is in that coalition? And when these groups get there, will they suddenly look at each other and go, "Oh God, that's not who I want to be spending my time with. That wasn't the idea." Again, we haven't seen that yet, but I mean, this is cliche time again. I mean, this is a honeymoon period. People are wandering around the streets of Damascus in a state of euphoria. And as you were saying, banks are due to open again tomorrow morning. State institutions, HTS, the sort of transition authorities have told people to go back to their offices, to go back to work. They have issued an instruction for members of the Ba'ath Party. This was the party that for decades under the two Assads was the dominant party there. The same name, of course, of the Saddam Hussein party. They were two parts of the same party originally that splintered off, and said that they need to register. They need to hand in any weapons that they have. They need to hand in any documents that they have. They need to hand in their cards. But that the implication being, if you do that, you can go about your business, you'll get a job, etc., etc. The same with the army, essentially saying, give up your uniform. Well, keep your uniform. I'm not sure we're going to change that, but just give yourself up, and you will probably find yourself still, if you want to be a member of the armed forces in the next week. This can all go horribly wrong. I mean, obviously. But again, it is, if you look at what happened in Iraq, it is a lesson learned from there. And there isn't, again, I mean, I don't want to sound naive, because obviously there are outside forces, all the time. You just said that the US had bombed IS positions. Israel has been on maneuvers down in the south. It's carried out a lot of...
Audrey, you need to turn your volume off, sorry.
Israel has carried out carried out a lot of airstrikes today. It's gone over onto the Syrian side of the occupied Golan Heights, and in the north, we've also seen Turkish-backed forces taking control of Manbij, a town up there from the Kurds. So all of this is going on, but you don't have one coherent, dominant outside force as you did in Iraq calling the shots. And when you say the mistake that was made there, that everyone says that essentially they tried to go from ground zero. So there was no state. It had to be constructed up, and there was no way of doing that. There isn't actually an outside force saying this is what's going to happen now. This at the moment is being left to the people who led the rebellion, and they are perhaps the best people to decide the way that they should go forward on this. That, again, could potentially be a hopeful element in what's happening.
Okay, I'm not taking all the questions that we've been given. I think a lot of them have been covered already, so forgive me for not coming to you. But I am going to get a question from Tim Ripley, whose I think question has been asked. But Tim, some thoughts or questions?
Interesting question. I mean, the thing that really mystifies me about this is, from the get-go, 12 days ago, the Syrian army has just put up token resistance. I mean, given that it's full of officers who are have fanatical hatred of HTS and all it does, and they're utterly brutal people. That they have a tradition of fighting these guys, and they just legged it. They just retreated, not even attempted to fight.
There's a big conspiracy there. You think there was some...
Well, the two things also. Are these guys going to make their last stand on the coast with the Russians, because that part of the country has a mountain range. We've had no reports of any of the rebels trying to enter that area. And is there a deal where these guys have got, you can stay in that zone and we won't touch you if you leave the rest of the country?
I mean, the second part of your question is very interesting. We don't know. There could be, because of course, as we've been saying, and as I'm sure you know very well, that already existed in the status quo before President Assad's fall in a number of regions of a country where essentially they were out of central government control. So that is a possibility. I mean, what I've been hearing from Alawites, from correspondents and colleagues and people who are there talking to officials and also just ordinary people, is that there isn't any sense at the moment of any real kind of resistance in the Alawite heartland against what has happened. It seems, I mean, we don't know for sure, but there seems to be some relative kind of acceptance. And on your first question, again, I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable question. Of course it is. But I think you have to make a distinction, perhaps, between the Syrian government army, the government forces, which just collapsed and didn't put up a fight at all, and the paramilitaries and the militias and the sort of non-state actors who were fighting at the height of the civil war on President Assad's side and were the most brutal. I mean, often the run-of-the-mill conscript soldiers were just cannon fodder, or they were massacred by ISIS or even Nusra Front at certain times and in their bases, and were unable to put up much of a fight. So I think that isn't a complete mystery about that. As I say, the mystery to some extent is that those other forces, much smaller, but much more efficient, much more effective, and with much more to lose, you would think, didn't put up that last hold out, that last fight. So yes, of course, there is a possibility that such forces may still be operative, well, not operative, but latent within Syria, and they may show themselves in the coming weeks and months. And there may be an armed opposition, specifically from that group, who were the closest loyalists and the most brutal loyalists to President Assad. There's no way to rule that out. It would be silly, stupid to say that. I think the one thing one might say is that the people who controlled those groups enriched themselves to such an extent that they weren't really stuck in Syria. President Assad had to stay there. He stayed there, at times when it looked like he was going to be defeated. Back in 2014, back in 2015, he stayed, to give him his due, he stayed in the palace, and he didn't cut and run then. But I think the people around him had established for a long time, and they weren't the faces of the regime, so there was no need for them to publicly be there. And I would say that most of them were probably already gone by the time that this all went down, and that they are in their various bolt holes, very, very comfortable bolt holes around the globe. But we shall see. I'm not dismissing what you're saying at all. I think it makes sense, but we haven't seen any real signs of that as yet. And I'm trying to remember in Iraq how early we started to see those signs. There certainly was a period when it didn't seem that was necessarily going to happen. So yeah, let's not dismiss it at all.
6 to 8 weeks, Iraq.
Yeah.
6 to 8 weeks, not long at all. Audrey Wolf had a question, and I think she's disappeared, but she wanted to know what has happened to the American journalist Austin Tice. Austin Tice was seized some time back, I think 2012, a long time ago. Former ex-US Marine, American journalist, and I think he contributed to the Washington Post. And the Americans said that they thought the Syrian government had him. A brief comment on that, and I think we're going to wrap up.
Well, all I've seen is that the US is sending a specialist in these hostage situations to the region now, with the specific mission to try and get to the heart of what's happened to Austin Tice. I mean, there have been many rumors at different stages over where he was held, what has happened to him. I haven't kept up with him, to be honest, over the past few years. He's sort of gone off the radar. I don't think it's been entirely dismissed, the fact that he might still be alive. Certainly, as I say, the US sees it as a priority. And again, it's one of the announcements that it's made, but it's looking into that actively.
And we're certainly going to be hearing the terrible stories about people being imprisoned by the Syrian security services coming out in the next few days. So there'll be certainly more about that. Sebastian, this has been absolutely fantastic. It's a real privilege to hear you talk and share your knowledge with us. And I hope that we can get to see you in person very shortly.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Nick, and a pleasure to speak to your loyal tourists.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.